luister na graafte, na die gesprek en 'n soort van siening oor hoe jy van die Boereoorlog moet interpreteer en so.
Ja, dankie. Ek het hier 'n kort opsomming van synopsis of the main points I'd like to discuss. I've got about 10 of these. If you could just circulate it and distribute them if it needs be. So miskien moet ek hierdie kant ook net. Ja. Een bladsy, ja. Dis een bladsy op. As jy net kan dit versprei asseblief, ja. Ja. I'm going to start over with the advertising slot. And dis wat die boek, die Engelse uitgawe van die Handsoppers and Joiners. Ek is bevrees ek het die bod baie hoog ingesit, dis R500. Maar as jy my handtekening in die boek wil hê, is dit R200. So you can get it for 200 if you haven't got a copy of it. Yeah, so that's the end of the advertising spot. What I want to talk about on today is writing on the Anglo-Boer War of 1899-1902, an ortho-ethnographic reflective journey. Now, it sounds all very grand and academic. It's got that academic gloss to it, die type jargon waarvan akademici dikwels hou. But it does serve a purpose. The ortho-ethnographic refers to an approach where one draws on one's own experiences as an aid to deeper understanding. In this case, trying to fathom why one has explored certain historical topics. I think it's also applicable to many people here. Why have you got this particular interest in the Anglo-Boer War? Or to use this more modern parlance, the South African War, which I prefer not to use. But why did one develop that particular interest? Hoekom stel ons hoegenaamd daarin belang? Because being interested in history is not a natural thing to do. It's rather eccentric. And that intrigues me. How did one come to spend one's life doing this kind of thing? Now, there are all kinds of dangers to this. It can easily descend into self-indulgent puffery, solipsism which can hardly be avoided, but should as far as possible be curbed. Academics are very prone to make their little fishes talk like whales. And I will try and avoid that, but I'm not saying I've been able to do that completely. Now, as a further justification, I should mention that this genre is not all that strange. Such writings have been called interventionists, inasmuch as they provide additional grist to the historiographical mill in revealing often submerged dimensions of certain trends. It allows one to understand the literature of an event of South African history, how it's been produced and what fed into it. It allows one to understand that slightly better. There are some notable contributions in this respect. Phyllis Lewson, she was at Wits University. I wrote a book on the reflections. Herman Gillemier, who was at UCT, then at Stellenbosch, did the same. And Ad van Wyk, who was a colleague of mine at University of South Africa, did the same. More recently, Charles van Onselen, in his book Night Trains, have got a separate chapter where he describes how his own interest in the underclasses in South Africa developed. So these are the kind of well springs that inform people's understanding and their interest in history per se, and a particular line of history. Now my offering is much more limited and modest in scope. I just focus on the Anglo-Boer War and try to trace the influences as well as their ramifications, which then forms a backdrop against my other work. I've written other material as well, and but I think right from the start, my main kind of line was the Anglo-Boer War, though I think I've probably written enough on it now to try and do other things as well. But so that's as far as that is concerned, but there's one other additional consideration, and which one should perhaps take to heart. Writing on the American historical profession, Professor Ian Tyrrell has observed in 2005. He started, I quote, he said, "Historical fashions change, and with them go the fates of historians. We write about the past. Most of us hope that our research has got enduring value, yet our work often fades rapidly after we pass from the scene, to be discarded in search of new interpretations, new debates. We have become the forgotten, and it's something which one should at times take to heart, that there's a new generation emerging, they've got different approaches. The same way when our generation was young, we had a new approach. And one has got to grant the leeway to a new generation to explore those. Although I would like to add, though, that it can also enrich their work if they take note of what has been written earlier on. And perhaps they can learn from that. But I won't lay that down as a kind of dictum, as a voorvereiste vir wat moet gebeur. Ultimately, we're all bound to be forgotten. But then it's heartening to see people here who've really got it's heartening to see people here who've got that strong interest in the war. And historically, and it's not necessarily swayed by ideological considerations and fashions and that. These are the kind of people, and what they do is kind of hardcore stuff. That is net, it's not kind of flavor of the month. And I think one should recognize that as well. Therefore, I'm particularly grateful that you've asked me to talk here today and allow me to reflect on where I stand. Now, what are these well springs that influence one's interest in historical writing? I happened to grow up in a bookish home. But as a callow youth, I did not regard myself as a bookworm. I didn't want to be a nerd. I tried my best not to be a nerd, and I played sport and all kinds of things with moderate success. And but eventually, I turned to books as a kind of solace, as a kind of opening up of the world. Ons is van dieselfde generasie. Boeke was 'n manier om te leer. Daar was nie internet nie, daar was nie TV nie, daar was koerante en boeke. En wat vir my nogal ontstellend is deesdae is hoe die status van die boek verminder. Hierso binne 10 minute is daai boek van R500 na R200 afgeslaan, hè. So yeah, that is just what one has got to live with. But anyway, I developed a long-term interest in books, and I haven't got the same kind of library that Dr. van Dijk had, but I got a fair number of books, and My wife has now forbidden me to buy any more books, so I'm trying to get rid of some of the stuff that I got. My curiosity started up in my father's study at Oudtshoorn. He was awarded a PhD from the University of Stellenbosch in 1945 for a thesis on the Cape Parliament from 1872 to 1910, with special reference to party politics. It was eventually published in the Archives Yearbook in 1969. My father dutifully collected those archive series, and I got the whole collection, and it's intact. Those green books fascinated me, and I just thought, what a lot of history is locked up in this. But it's often written fairly inaccessibly. So you really got to be interested to start reading the Archives Yearbook. And the thought occurred to me, these kind of so-called topics which may appear as obscure, how do they relate to the world in which I found myself in the late 60s and the early 70s? It was not an easy connection to make, but at that time there was still a simmering kind of tension between English and Afrikaners. Although it started in being ameliorated in the 1960s, it was still a current issue. And then I looked at my father's thesis. I thought perhaps I can understand something more about how these things arose. My father was generally a mild-mannered man, but he could be firm on occasions, but he wasn't generally given to strong opinions. So it was something of a surprise to me when I came across what must have been a quite unusually bold statement for him in his thesis, namely that during the War of 1899-1902, Britain trampled justice underfoot. For him, that was a strong statement, but it resonated with me. I thought, you've got to look at history a bit differently, and perhaps what happened in that war, that actually accelerated intra-white tensions. It was the first academic piece I'd read about the war, little knowing that I would later be completely drawn in by the writing on the conflict. Then next, what I regard as a kind of seminal moment in my early career was an army experience. I was one of the first batch of people who conscripted in 1967. I was unprepared for the army, as the army was unprepared for the deluge of new recruits which descended on them after the introduction of full-scale conscription for white males. The army seemed like organized chaos to me, but it was cemented by kind of propaganda, which one readily bought into. You didn't know anything else. You thought, well, there are terrorists out there, and you're going to play your part in it. I nowadays apologize that I haven't done enough, but yeah, that's sort of tongue in the cheek. But what struck me was that there was always a kind of underlying current there about if you don't do your bit in this war, the same is going to happen as what happened in the Anglo-Boer War, that the women and children will suffer, and that the terrorists will make sure that that'll be the case. So I think it dawned on me that also in the army that you weren't supposed to deviate from what they told you. You had to be disciplined. And I don't want to knock that. I think there's a lot to be said for discipline. But it doesn't mean that one's mind should be all that disciplined in the way one thinks about the past. And it struck me that perhaps the first seedlings of my later work on the so-called handsoppers and joiners can be found in my experience in the army. That there was this kind of notion that the Anglo-Boer War was a war of unity. Everybody was bitter enders, and they were 12 feet tall. And that was the kind of general demeanor, the general kind of propaganda that surfaced at that point. But later in my life, I came across quite a startling realization that not everybody were bitter enders. And I tried to connect that with my army experience. And I found it difficult to do, but I also found it intriguing. In retrospect, if I had not been to the army, I would have found it more difficult to understand the ramifications of apostasy. If I had that army experience and being slightly disillusioned by it, I wouldn't have gotten onto this kind of topic. Neither would I have experience or appreciation of military matters. So that in itself was a learning curve. Now, after post-army, I was fortunate to get a teacher's bursary, and I was destined to go to Stellenbosch University. My father had already booked me into his old residence, Dagbreek. However, I never saw the inside of the building. When I mentioned to my father that I thought about taking history as a subject, which I did fairly well at school, not exceptionally well, but fairly well, a red flag went up. He realized that would have meant that I would be subjected to the notorious quirks of Professor Piet van der Merwe, who was the head of department at Stellenbosch at that point. He had an unfortunate reputation as a most intimidating individual. I'm not casting any aspersions on his writing. They're quite remarkable for that period and detailed. Now, his kind of demeanor was fairly well known amongst the Stellenbosch cognoscenti. For someone like me who had already developed a kind of free-floating dislike of authoritarian behavior, my father in his wisdom realized that Piet van der Merwe and I would not be a good match. Thus it came about that I went to the University of the Free State in 1968, where a much more accommodating Professor Jaap Oberholz, an ex-Stellenbosch student, was in charge of the history department. I don't want to belabor the shortcomings of the history department at Stellenbosch. I think it was solid in the kind of research it did, but there was always a kind of lack of students were students, and they had to behave in a way that suits their position, that they were underlings really. And they weren't taken seriously as individuals. As a matter of fact, Piet van der Merwe, it was quite impossible. He had where the students had to present essays in class, and they had to read the essays. And then some of the female students read an essay, and he interrupted her midway. En hy asked her, juffrou, uit watter resepteboek kry jy daai geskiedenis? So it was actually a double kind of blow, you know. It was, today you won't get away with that kind of nonsense. So, but besides that, there was a serious thing about facts, and you've got to ascertain facts. At times it went quite overboard. It lacked kind of conceptual context. But that was Stellenbosch in the 1960s. Free State was a bit more free-floating. They had fewer pretensions at Stellenbosch, and there were some good teachers who had their lecturers, Johan Moll, who impressed upon us that ordinary people also participated in history. We all used to learn about great leaders and the politics of great leaders and that kind of thing. But here was somebody who realized that ordinary burghers also played a role, which now seems self-evident, but not at the time. There were some other people like Henning van Aswegen, a strict disciplinarian, but not without the human touch. Furthermore, I came under the spell of the Free State, what I call the Free State rurality, and wide open spaces, die landlikheid van die Vrystaat. It through the Women's Monument, which we often visited as part of the History Society, it dawned upon me, or dawned upon even the most insensitive of those, that the Free State had a dramatic history. Now, this did not necessarily spark my interest in the war, but I think a general awareness of what I call in the paper the Boerness of the Free State made me more receptive to the history of the province. And in a superficial way as a student, what the inhabitants had to endure. If I had gone to Stellenbosch, I would have missed out on those sensibilities. Stellenbosch was sheltered. I mean, the closest it came to the war was actually the remount camp. But but it was sheltered from those kind of events. Now, strangely enough, although we weren't taught much war history, and those what we were taught about was all about battles and the like, which didn't have a particular appeal to me. But we were asked in our honours year to write an essay on the town in the Free State, in the Eastern Free State, Senekal. It was quite a thriving town at the time. And Professor Ober also was commissioned to write a book. Now, the easiest way of doing that is get your honours students to do the research. And then you just rework it and everything is there, and you publish it under your name. So, QED. So, I was assigned the establishment of the town. Now, it's not exceptionally intriguing topic, not very exciting, but it did teach me how to do archival research. And interestingly enough, in the research, I came across a local leading light, the Venerable S.G. Villanelle, who I met again in my research on the Handsoppers and Joiners. He was quite a prominent figure in the town, but later he became a joiner. So in a different guise, I then met him as a Boer collaborator. So there were these interesting linkages which one only realized afterwards. Now, the next point there is becoming an historian of war at the University of South Africa at UNISA. I was fortunate to be, I taught for a while at Grey College in a temporary capacity, soon after I'd completed my teacher's diploma. But I'm afraid I wasn't a particularly good teacher. The children didn't, or the youngsters, or what do they call now, learners, they didn't take me too seriously. And I didn't take them too seriously as well. They used to smoke at the back of my class. I said, well, it's your problem if you're going to smoke, you know. I'm not going to intervene. And so that was, for obvious reasons, frowned upon. And so I then decided UNISA seems like a good place to go, where there are no live students and I don't have to discipline anybody. I was quite surprised when I was offered a temporary junior lectureship. At those days, you had, temporary juniorship was the lowest rank in academia. But I was excited at the prospect. I started in 1973, but I found it harder going than initially anticipated. I was quite gormless and naive about the chicanery of academic life. And I was given a rude awakening when a grizzled veteran bluntly warned me, watch out, here they will cut your throat for a sixpence. Jy moet oppas, hier stel jou keel af vir 'n sixpence. I mentioned this at a paper I did quite a number of years ago about the history of the history department at UNISA, and I mentioned this, hulle gaan jou keel afsny vir 'n sixpence hierso. And suddenly there was a forest of hands going up. I said, what is a sixpence? So I realized you got to adapt to your audience often. Now, anyway, it was an apt remark, and not that I necessarily followed that. I thought all academics were just searching for the truth, which true up to a point, but not the complete truth. And but UNISA had a wonderful library, it still has, and it was close to the state archives. And I couldn't believe how fortunate I was that you were supposed to be there at UNISA at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you were picked up by a bus. We lived in Arcadia, and picked up by a bus, transported to university. At 1 o'clock, the place closes down. Then you take the bus home again. And you can also go to the archives then. So for a long time, that was a perfect arrangement. And I was able to do a lot of work in the archives. It suited me very well, and I was very fortunate. It was also a growing concern, UNISA. Many of them intellectually vibrant. Many of them were also bilingual, which I think it helped my English, hopefully. But of course, ek moes eers Stellenbosch toe kom om werklik my Engels te verbeter. Jy weet so. Maar dit het eers later gebeur. It grew exponentially. There was a staff of 35 people in the history department in the 1990s. And I still got contact with some of those people. It was really a most exhilarating time to be an historian. Now, particularly influential in my career was Barrett Spies, who, when I arrived at UNISA, was on the point of finishing off his magnum opus. And I think to this day it's a work that's not always sufficiently recognized, on Roberts, Kitchener and Civilians, Methods of Barbarism. I was most impressed by Spies as a person and as a scholar. Once I finished my research, or my thesis and that, we used to play squash, and he was quite a formidable squash player, also a good cricketer. We played in the university team together, so there were those kind of connections. I always looked up to him as a kind of worthy individual to be emulated. He could be aloof at times, he could be quite distant, but that just added to his mystique. It was at this point that I started scratching around for an MA, and I came across an article by a man called Dale Garson, who later was head of the history department at Wits, who wrote on Het Volk, the political party after the war in the Transvaal. He mentioned in passing the issue of joiners, and I latched onto this. I thought this would be an important topic for a MA. And it resonated with my emergent awareness that history was much more complicated than what I'd earlier imagined. There were indeed new views to be explored, new contributions to be made. It wasn't cast in stone. So, and I contrasted that with my prevailing perceptions of the military. That here was something quite out of the ordinary. I eagerly approached Spies. He was cautious, and he told me it'll be a difficult topic with plenty of research. He was right there, and it may take a long time to complete. He was wrong there. I completed it within 3 years, and the reason for that was I wouldn't have had a permanent appointment if I didn't complete the MA. So that it did actually concentrate the mind. And I was up for that kind of challenge. But being young and somewhat impetuous, I did not fully understand the notion of turf wars when it came to research on the Anglo-Boer War. Researchers on South Africa's premier war formed an almost exclusive club, and they were tacitly underlying that. They were very particular on who was allowed to do what. Spies had just gained entrance to the club after his book or his thesis on Kitchener, Roberts and Civilians, and he was held in high regard, but some other crusty members of the guild had strong reservations about endorsing a young upstart like myself to work on what was considered very contentious issues. Now, I was kind of vaguely aware of that, but through a sense of ignorance and cussedness, I was not prepared to deviate. And Spies supported me wholeheartedly. He made copious and most helpful comments on drafts of my work. It was still handwritten, and everything was handwritten, and I had to read it, to rewrite it as well, so that in the proper handwriting, so that he could read that. When I started research, there wasn't even photostat copies. You had to write down all notes by hand. Later on, photostats, we were allowed to use photostats in the archives. Still to this day, when I supervise theses, of which I had quite a number, and I think they take an extraordinary amount of time, and in doing it properly, what I regard as properly. And that all goes back to the influence of Burridge Spies. And it's not only supervising a thesis and writing comments, it's also establishing a kind of relationship with the student. Now, where does the student belong in this whole? How does the student perceive a piece? Because that may influence your interaction with the student as well. Furthermore, yeah, it sounds like I'm that I assess Burridge too highly, but I can't escape that without his kind of dedication as an educator, my life would have been much more difficult. It also alerted me to the notion of war in society, that it doesn't, war, obviously battles are important, but it doesn't only have to be that. You can also look at the interaction between kind of societies, the kind of wars that they fight, and all of this was very evident in the Anglo-Boer War. What has become a mantra in my own work was that of the British historian Eric Hobsbawm, and I just want to quote him here. I think the profitability of the studies of social conflict requires more careful assessment. They dramatize crucial elements of social structure because they here strain to the breaking point. Certain problems cannot be studied at all except through moments of eruption, which do not merely bring into the open so much as normally latent, but also concentrate and magnify phenomena for the benefit of the student. Whilst not the least of the advantages, normally multiplying our documentation about them. Kortweg is oorloë 'n toets vir 'n samelewing. En dit, as jy daai tipe begrip kan hanteer, dan sien jy goed raak wat jy anders is nie sou raak sien nie. Besides Burridge Spies had the advantage of having Franz Johan Pretorius, who's well known in this grouping, as a colleague at UNISA. Even at the start of his career, he had a wide reach and in-depth knowledge of the war. I also benefited from discussions with Paul Sitzman, an unassuming scholar with a fine turn of phrase and a nuanced understanding of the post-war politics. And there were some others as well. I want to move on to some key wider issues which emerged from this. And I think the one that I got to single out was my work on the Handsoppers and Joiners that left a lasting impression, was the question of poor white Bywoner representativity amongst the joiners. As it was fairly high, in one joiner outfit, 75% of the total number of members. It went some distance to explain the social composition of the group. This in turn helped to provide an explanation for the apostasy that included material considerations. Voor die tyd is dan net gesê, hierdie mense was net dom en lafhartig. En daar is geen rasionaal daarvoor dat jy jou eie mense moet beklei nie. Here at least I found not a plausible reason why they did it. One didn't necessarily countenance it, jy het dit nie goedgekeur nie, maar jy het begin verstaan, beter verstaan waarom hulle so opgetree het. Hulle is plase beloof na die oorlog, hulle het 5 shillings betaal, so daar was voordele in gewees, veral vir bywoners wat nooit geleenthede gehad het om finansiëel selfstandig te word nie. So they used the war as a kind of way of getting back. It became a class war in Afrikaner circles. Now, I must say, though, that this discovery was not all that original. Earlier on, Donald Noon, in his book Grand Illusion, had hinted at that, but Spies encouraged me to find considerable more evidence before I was prepared to accept the interpretation. And I think I found sufficient evidence to that effect. And I'd written on these issues before the emergence of the history workshop at Wits in the 1970s. They focused more regionally on social history and the importance of class. And my already established interest in class found a ready way into what they were doing. I increasingly started to show an interest in research emanating from the history workshop, and my forays into the Anglo-Boer War history served as a bridgehead for wider explorations. This then extended to the 1914 Boer Rebellion, which also had a sizable number of poor white rebels. This discovery, if it can once be called that, was first sparked by my reading of an article by Rodney Davenport in which he had a throwaway line on the poor white presence in the rebellion. Once again, it alerted me to one thinks, one discovers new things, but there are always other people. They may not have done it as fully, but they were aware of these issues. I then pursued that, and along with other scholars, and in 2009 I co-authored a book on the rebellion. So there was something else which happened during the emergence of the 1990s, 2000s, was the idea of historical representation. Hoe word die verlede in die hede begryp? In verskillende fases in die verlede, hoe is die Boereoorlog vertolk? What were the ways in which the Boer War has been interpreted, particularly in Afrikaans circles? This allowed me to look at the way of the Boer War, how it featured in the 20th century Afrikaner nationalist consciousness. I found this a rich vein to pursue, and I did a similar piece on the Women's Monument in Bloemfontein. And then an opportunity which was far too good to be missed was that of the centennial occasion of the Anglo-Boer War, which allowed me to look at how the commemorations have been reframed over time, and then ending up with the 2002 interpretation, which then became a fully fledged article. Yeah, okay. I'm on the point of finishing off, but I just want to mention that I had the Boer War spilled over in a number of other publications, which the more I try to stay away from writing on the Anglo-Boer War, it didn't quite happen. And but I also realized that you got to spread your wings somewhat, and then I did a thesis on South African black people in the First World War, which I enjoyed doing because that opened up a completely new era, which I didn't look at any detail before that. But it was still the issue of war and how the war impacted on black South Africans. It also raised the issue of the Mendi, which sank off the Isle of Wight in 21st of February 1917 with a loss of about 615 black soldiers. They were non-combatant soldiers. But so that alerted me to how did the Mendi, what was the role of the Mendi in African consciousness? I also found there was quite a lot was made of the soldiers, of some soldiers just before the ship sank, that they did a death drill, claiming we're all Xhosa, Sotho, Zulu, etc., and we're here to die, that's what we came for. And of course that later turned out to be complete fiction and part of African mythology, which I wrote about later in 2011, which wasn't that particularly well received. It's interesting how how difficult it is to dislodge perceived perceptions of history. And to deviate a bit now, I found the same with my recent book on Van Zyl Slabber. I did my best to understand, I'm deviating now, but in a way I can say that Van Zyl Slabber was also seen as a handjobber by Afrikaners. So there's some kind of connection there. But I was also struck by the way that he was seen as not a very good handsupper. He just left the cause, and I had rude letters from old Proc supporters in the southern suburbs of Cape Town, Pinelands, amongst others. Well, I tried to explain what Slabber did. They said, no, man, you go too far much length. The man didn't have any backbone. So, here you're back to the joiners and the handsoppers, and it's difficult to dislodge that. There's just no way you can, that's what people believe. It's like it's almost like it gives you a shorthand to understand the world, particularly the past. And you're not going to spend too much on the past as long as you've got a firm grip on it, what you think is a firm grip. You can entertain people at dinner parties and show how clever you are. So, that's what doing war history alerted me to, how the various dimensions to it, and how it can easily, because it's such crucial events that happen. Everybody knows something about it, but usually it's not all that accurate. Let me conclude. Overall, the war has been academically good for me. I can look back upon several intriguing issues I was privileged to research and analyze. Also opened up other topics for investigation. Now, embarking on that journey many years ago, it's ultimately led me to unexpected places of the mind. Not only have academic vistas opened up, but in the process, I've also met individuals who have enriched my life. I didn't have as many PhD students on the war as I would have liked to. A few stand out though. Karel van der Merwe, what Arnold ken, as a PhD student, produced a remarkable thesis on General Ben Viljoen, published in 2019. The redoubtable Taffy Shearing and her work on the Cape Rebels also come to mind. Lauren has encountered Taffy Shearing's work. And on MA level, Nikki Strydom has written a book which is often mentioned in the general literature, the topic, about children and the war, but she looked in quite considerable detail about children. Finally, as I try to argue in this piece, one's subterranean impulses may well play a part in the kind of topic one is inclined to gravitate towards. Now, of course, this does not mean that it has to be valid for all researchers. One should also guard against confirmation bias. Historical documents, as I've learned, hardly say no to yes-type questions. Equally so, there's the ever-present danger of having one's little fishes talk like whales. Now, yet, for all of this, historians are not empty vessels waiting to be filled. The wellsprings of their work emanate from within. Thank you for your aandag. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Prof. As our Prof.
I tell them that historians are not empty vessels. I can only say, don't you so. What we say is that niemand kan. Praat maar, man. Trek maar praat. Dat niemand kan eintlik volkome objektief wees oor die geskiedenis.
Ja.
Nou, ek het 'n paadjie geloop wat hy vir ons baie interessant geskets het hierso. As jy jouself die vraag vandag moet aanvra oor jou persoonlike objektiviteit as 'n historikus, professor Piet van der Merwe destijds, vergeet nou dat het Piet Vark was, hoe praat het as die historikus wat geskryf het oor die grensoorloë.
Ja.
Hoe maklik of hoe moeilik het u dit gevind? En waar jy vandag nog, al is het oor van sy slawe wat jy skryf, en oor die rebellie of oor elke boereoorlog, hoe maklik of hoe moeilik vind u dit om 'n hoë standaard van objektiviteit te bereik? Watter reëls gee jy vir jouself om dit suksesvol te doen?
Dat is 'n belangrike vraag. Ek dink
dit is geslaag in jou eie mening.
Nee. Ek dink ek wil nie. Ek sê dit is 'n belangrike vraag, want mens worstel die hele tyd daarmee. Een keer vir 'n man gesê, hy sê maar dis my objektiewe mening. Toe vra die joernalis vir hom, aan wie se kant is jy objektief? I mean, it becomes an easy way out to say ek is objektief en dit, maar dis nie 'n antwoord nie. En ek dink baie keer is Afrikaanse geskiedskrywing het bietjie gelei daaronder, omdat hulle al die bronne gekyk, hulle baie goed met die bronne. Maar hulle het gesê, omdat die bronne dit sê, daarom is hulle objektief. Maar dan laat jy nie ruimte daarvoor dat jy die goed vertolk nie, volgens 'n stel vrae wat jy vra. En dit is daai vrae wat bepaal hoe oortuigend jou werk is. Ek dink die kwessie van objektiviteit is belangrik en ek raak geïrriteerd as ek 'n werk begin lees en ek sien maar hierdie persoon het net 'n argument wat hy wil voer en dit is baie duidelik waarop hy of sy afstuur. So my antwoord daarop is altyd that you must have a point of view, but you could also be prepared to run that point of view against the grain. Jy moet dit teen die grein laat loop. Jy moet jou eie voorveronderstellings bevraagteken en dit uitspel. En wat jy ultimately moet uiteindelik probeer doen, is om dieper te delf, om beter te verstaan. In daardie sin sou ek sê, ek het probeer objektief wees, maar die term is vir my ook problematies, want niemand kan werklik so objektief wees dat jy daarop kan aanspraak maak nie. Ek sal nie dit doen nie. Maar ek sal wel wil sê, ek het van verskillende hoeke probeer kyk, verskillende invalshoeke, and I try not to make my little fishes talk like whales. Vandag het ek heeltemal oortree, maar dit bly by altyd by. Ja.
Dis seker ook nie nodig nie. Ek het my vrae is in 3 vorms. Jou boek, soos dit heiliglik daar is dit net, gaan dit net oor ek wil amper sê die wit Afrikaner, die wit Engelsman, en natuurlik dan sluit dit dan ook die swart kontingent ook in wat in die land was. Is die eerste vraag. Tweede vraag, wat het geword van die joiners na die oorlog? Het die bietjie daarop geraak?
Ja.
Ek wil net by dit wil ek voeg, ek het in Pretoria grootgeword. In 'n tyd toe Polditch nie daar was nie, toe daar 'n plakkerskamp was.
Polditch, ja. Die atletiekbaan.
Ja, voor die atletiekbaan was daar 'n plakkerskamp.
Okay, ja.
En snaaks genoeg, daai wat plakkers was geskuif na 'n plek kan Japan was dit in Danville.
Ja.
En het tannie het my eendag daar gesê, tannie, dit besig om seep te maak. En ek het wag, vrou, wat maak tannie? Is dit kos? Sy sê nee, ek maak seep. Vraag maar nou, hoe eindig 'n mens hierop? Dus sê, omdat niemand het geweet dat die Afrikaner binne 8 jaar weer van die land sou gewees het. Sê vir wat bedoel jy daarby? Sê maar my voorvaders was joiners.
Ja.
En na die Afrikaner oorgeneem het, was ons in hierdie wit plakkerskamp gegooi, want ons was verstoot deur mense wat ons geken het. Obviously mense wat in die dorp gebly het, geweet dat hulle joiners was. Maar vir my, dit bly my altyd by. Sluit dit hierdie gedeelte in van die boek?
Ja, dis 'n eerste vraag te antwoord. dit gaan primêr oor die boere en dan natuurlijk die Engelse invloed wat begin geld het. Daar is ook verwysings na swartes in soverre daar joiner regimente of eenhede was wat saam met swartes in die oorlog geveg het. Veral in Winburg omgewing, Olaf Berg scouts wat 'n gemengde groep was en hulle was baie gehaat onder die boere. So in daardie sin bring ek dit wel te berde, maar dit is sover soos dit gaan. Dan wat na die oorlog gebeur het met die joiners, dis baie interessant wat jy my vertel. Ek het geweet en dit sluit eintlik bietjie aan by wat ek gesê het. Baie van hulle was arm voor die oorlog. En hulle het miskien gehoop hulle sou geld maak, maar hulle het nie genoeg geld gemaak nie en hulle is verstoot. Daar is geweldige antagonisme teenoor joiners gewees. Veral in die hulle kamp was by Myntjieskop, net daar bo die Unie-geboue. En ek dink dat daarvan het hulle seker geskuif na die res, na Pretoria West, soos jy nou vertel het, jy weet daar by Pildies, Prinslooster, daar by die zoo is daar omgewing.
Ja, kom ek sê, so daai plakkerskamp was basies waar die skouterrein later jare was in Pretoria.
Ja.
Daai hele area was 'n wit plakkerskamp.
Ja, en Danville is vandag nog 'n tipe arm-blanke samelewing. Het gaan baie sleg daar, so ek het goed gelees daaroor en dis altyd die vraag by my, 'n bietjie uit te brei daaroop, is in Suid-Afrika het 1960 begin ryk word, maar as jy nie toe op die bus geklim het nie, dan gaan jy vandag sukkel. En ek dink dit is wat daar gebeur het nou met Danville was altyd maar armoedig geweest. So ek dink daai wat jy vertel van die vrou is baie interessant, is baie openhartig ook, ja.
Ek dink die derde deel van die vraag is wat ek basies aan u wil vra is, in verband met die studies het u name wat u in die boek noem, spesifieke families wat pertinent betrokke was daarbey, of het u dit uitgevoer?
Ja, ek gaan nou, lyk my jy stel baie belang in, die boek is baie goedkoop nou vir jou gelees. Maar ja, nee, daar is 'n storie oor die name is in die boek, jy weet, jy kry no extra charge. So, maar daar is ook 'n storie oor die name, Arnold sal dit weet, dat toe ek aanvanklik die navorsing gedoen het, wil nie name, die argiewe dit weggesteek. Daar is 'n verbod daarop gewees, 'n moratorium daarop. En die korrigeer my as ek verkeerd is, maar dit het gegaan oor Jim Fouché, wat in die Suid-Vrystaat gebly het in Roewel distrik. Sy mense was handjobbers geweest wat gaan skuil het in Besoedeland destyds. En hulle het al daai name gekry, ook joiner name is opgeteken, maar toe hy nou president word, hy was eers minister van verdediging, bietjie vreemd, maar in elk geval, toe het hy president word, het hulle dit weggesluit. Toe ek begin werk het oor hierdie goed, mag ek nie daarna gekyk het nie. Maar na 94 toe kon ek nou die name kry en ek het toe moeite gedoen om op te spoor en dis gepubliseer in die Afrikaanse sowel as die Engels. Dis nie alles nie, maar dis 'n goeie seleksie daarvan. Ja.
Is dit dieselfde as jou Afrikaanse boek?
Daar's 'n Afrikaanse uitgawe in 99 verskyn.
Ek weet die Afrikaanse
Ja,
wil beter.
Die Engels is net beter as die Afrikaans.
Ek sal glo. Verstaan jy?
Hy die name in Chris, so jy kan kyk na die voorsaat.
Yeah, thanks, Albert. It was obviously good to listen to your talk, and I think we can all appreciate your honesty. I think for me that is the key in your talk. Few things that maybe and you can maybe advise there. I mean, you have a young student here, and I think the important thing is, ek dink die belangrike ding vir jong mense, jy weet, hoe kry 'n mens jong mense geïnteresseerd om natuurlik nou 50 jaar later oor die onderwerp navorsing te doen,
Ja.
veral in die lig van, en ek dink jy het dit nou aangeraak in jou praatjie, jy weet die verandering, as jy vat die geweldige verandering, julle ouens wat nou 50 jaar terug in 'n argief moes gesit het, jou metode van inligting kry, het net soveel langer geneem. Jy weet, vandag is dit nou makliker om inligting te kry, maar dit skep waarskynlik weer ander probleme, in die sin dat daar's 'n bietjie van 'n bombardering van inligting vir 'n jong student. Dit mag miskien die interpretasie 'n bietjie moeiliker maak, maar gaan hulle voldoende deur al daai, jy weet, massiewe bronne.
Ja.
So dit is my een ding waar ek graag jou antwoord wil hoor. Tweedens, baie interessante ding, en dit kom nou by die later ding wat jy aangeraak het, jy weet, oor spesifiek nou die handsoppers en joiners, en 'n ding wat ek nou oor die jare oor gewonder het, wat ek natuurlik nie werklike diepgaande gronde het om dit te sê nie, maar my interpretasie rofweg van, kom maar van dagboeke en naamlyste wat ek bietjie gekyk het na kiesafdelings, jy weet, nadat Hertzog nou weggebreek het in 1912, 1915, dink ek het die, en ek kyk spesifiek hier na die Vrystaat, want Hertzog, hulle het 6 setels, ek dink in 1915 gewen, die nasionale party. Maar as jy teruggaan, dan is dit vir my baie interessant, dat dit klomp van daai ouens, wat vir hom gestem het in die Suid-Vrystaat. En ek het al gewonder, ek kry nie voldoende studie daaroor natuurlik nie, materiaal nie, maar 'n ou sou graag wou weet, watter persentasie van daai Suid-Vrystaters, wat tydens die oorlog in Besoedeland geskuil het, en miskien selfs joiners was, ek praat nou van die handsoppers, gooi ek nou hierby, het vir die nasionale party gestem in 1915, en jy weet watter, daar's 'n paar wat ek nou van weet, uiteraard, en soos jy het reg sê, kyk, Jim was gebore in Besoedeland. Interessant genoeg. Ja. So hy was in Besoedeland gebore, terwyl sy ouers daar nou nie joiners was nie, maar hulle was handsoppers. En oor die grens gegaan. So, jy weet, daai is 'n interessante konsep, so dit kan natuurlik hierdie studie van jou heel wat verder neem. As 'n ou genoeg navorsing of mense wat belangstel, wat soos Lawrence se kollegas.
Nee, kyk, dit is 'n eerste vraag te antwoord. Hoe mense jeugdige mense belangstel het in die geskiedenis. Ek sien gister tot my ontsteltenis, sien ek dat in die koerant, dat altyd die onderhoude met oor hoe is die vakke gewees in die burger. Jy sê die sekspersoon, daar is baie min skole wat nog geskiedenis as 'n vak aanbied. En ek wil 'n bietjie daar, ook 'n bietjie verder kyk daarna, want dis nogal, dis vir my, niemand merk het op, niemand praat oor geskiedenis en dit en dat, maar min mense weet eintlik wat aangaan in skole met geskiedenis. Geskiedenis word maklik net gedamp as het ware, jy weet, dit is nie van belang meer nie. Dit is ontstelend, maar wat ek gevind het toe ek in die docent was, wat ek probeer doen het, is om aan te sluit by studente se beleweniswêreld, en ek het dit veral probeer regkry deur die grensoorlog te berde te bring. En daar is soveel van daai jong mense wat as ouers in die grensoorlog betrokke was. Dan het hulle vir my gesê, my pa praat nie daaroor nie, maar dit bly broei. Maar hy praat nie daaroor nie. Of die ander uiterste was, dis al waaroor hy praat, jy weet. Dit is soos van 'n sentrale punt van sy bestaan gewees. Ja. So, mense moet maar probeer innovatiewe maniere bedink om studente te laat besef dat geskiedenis is nie daar ver weg nie, dit is jou eie gesin geraak. En dit is iets wat deel is van jou bewussyn, alhoewel jy moet dit kan belig, jy weet. En I don't know, Lauren, perhaps you would like to elaborate on how you got into history or whether that, yeah, if I don't want to put you on the spot, but yeah.
I mean, I think the key thing is that having people spark that curiosity is what's going to be the initial thing that draws people. And then from there, you're looking for different perspectives.
Mm.
And you say there's a lot more information available. That makes the job more difficult, actually. We've got over 130 years of writings on the Boer War, which have conflicting arguments and conflicting viewpoints. And so it's difficult to also assimilate everything into a narrative that is comprehensive. And you know, there's so many different micro topics where you need to be acknowledging this aspect and that aspect and being sensitive towards personal experiences and how things have been interpreted in their own heads as well. So you as a historian, you're not just telling a story, you're also bringing in personal viewpoints, and you know, diaries are they're so sensitive, they're so personal, and to be using things like that for research sometimes seems a bit crude is a good word. I read a lot of Deneys Reis's Commando book for this thesis, and you know, he goes in at length about personal experiences, you know, walking into an area and seeing bodies just laying strewed all over. You know, it's difficult. But luckily, we also have technology on our side these days. So I'm a historian who advocates for including new techniques. So research methodologies have also come a long way in the last couple of years. So for me, the quantitative aspect of research is very important to me, where the statistics and the databases that we can create can give us very interesting insights and novel contributions to research, which we previously wouldn't have really given much thought to if we hadn't analyzed it at that level. And luckily, computers do most of the work for us. So that's probably what makes the research become more alive now, 130 years later, is what new things we can contribute. You know, what questions haven't been answered. So many have, but yeah.
No, thanks for illuminating that. That takes me to the second question wat Arnold gevra het oor die Suid-Vrystaat en hoe die mense gestem het. Jy weet, daar was 'n throwaway line en wat Jan Smuts gesê het, dat al die National Scouts het gestem vir die nasionale party in daai gedeelte. Hy het so hy het 'n aanvoeling gehad wat gebeur het en hy ken mos die wêreld, jy weet. En ek het altyd gedog dis fascinerend. Maar waar gaan jy nou al die detail kry wat Lauren gepraat oor? Jy weet, dis harde werk daar om daai goed uit te sniffel. En dan moet jy ook weet, jy gaan nie alles kry nie, jy moet ook deur die grein laat loop. Maar Smuts het 'n intuïtiewe aanvoeling gehad. Hy het ook gesê dat baie van die rebelle was eintlik National Scouts geweest van tevore. Nie baie nie, maar van hulle was. And that kind of makes sense because some of these rebels were quite poor. And so you get a replay of the Anglo-Boer War, where they joined up in the hope things will improve and they will be able to be better off after the new dispensation, as die boere weer oorgeneem het en hulle is nou aan die regte kant. Ja, so I mean, dat is fascinerende type.
Thank you very much. I think there is, maybe there is something to say for, which I feel, and obviously I'm subjective because I'm from, you know, I come from a medical background with a medical perspective, and obviously we read a lot in our field about, I'm very interested in you know, trauma, not only individual trauma, but transgenerational, intergenerational trauma. So in that sense, I might be subjective because I feel historians are sometimes a bit aloof, you know, to accept that, as you have indicated, these new fields of riches overlap very much to a certain sense. And it was not available 50 years ago. Now it is. And you know, to take the descendants of 350,000 Republicans and try and get that into a database and see what come out. But yeah, baie interessant, baie dankie Albert, Lauren, I think great discussion.
So can you end it off again?
No, it's a different question. My grandfather ran the crowd from Nesbitt's horse to Colonial Regiment in the Anglo War, South African born farmer from Eastern Cape, second generation, 1820 settler. A number of men in his particular unit I've seen on the roll of honor, people I've had Afrikaans names like Grundling, Van Niekerk,
Yeah.
like that. And then there was one, my brother picked up a little newspaper article from a newspaper in Eastern Cape somewhere about one of the guys called Panzergro who changed sides. Been a member of the unit, and he deserted.
Yeah.
And they caught him with the Boers
That's it,
in
yeah.
the Free State and
Yeah.
shot him, bang, stoned him. How much of that, how much of that went on? Because
Yeah,
it
no,
was
no.
obviously it was a similar situation.
Yeah.
He obviously got
But
into
it's just
it.
on the other
He was a
side.
poor man, he needed
Yeah.
a salary.
Yeah.
He had children and family. They all went to there's a whole description.
Yeah,
of
yeah.
His family went to the prison to see him and all sorts of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, no, I think it sounds very credible, and it's also a peculiar kind of Eastern Cape thing that Eastern Cape are kind of crossover identities. Though people may have had Afrikaans surnames, that English inclinations, and there was that kind of so that kind of made sense, you know. And, just to add to that, it's like it ties up with my earlier point, how wars bring out underlying trends in society. You know? En ek dink hierdie Panzergrou mense, ek weet ook van Panzergrous, they became quite, other side of the family became quite wealthy in die Vrystaat, in die Suid-Vrystaat. Kosie Panzergrou. But anyway, so yeah, I don't want to descend into that rabbit hole, but yeah.
Chris het 'n vraag.
Ja.
Ek wonder net hoeveel gewig dra buitefaktore wat mense se besluite maak. As voorbeeld, Andries Pretorius het in Natal agtergebly toe die ander toemaak geraak. Okay, Andries Pretorius het in Natal agtergebly toe die ander voortrekkers teruggetrek het Vrystaat. Nou sien jy die kerk het hom aangekla want hy ding aangaan met 'n 15-jarige meisietjie wat langs hulle gebly het. So dit het sy politiek gedrag. En net so as jy dit verder vat, die feit dat Louis Botha na die oorlog 'n kontrak gehad het om vleis in die myne te voorsien. Dan wonder jy, waar was sy lojaliteit? Jan Smuts, dink ek, was so diep eerlik, hulle kon hom net vang met eer. Hulle het hom net aanhou prys en eer en prys.
Ja, is baie susceptible daarvoor.
Ja, en dan kry jy 'n man soos De Wet wat wil aanhou oorlog maak.
Ja.
Sy probleem is, in die sosiale lewe is hy nul, maar in oorlog is hy meneer, so hy kan nie vrede maak.
Dis 'n baie goeie punt, ja. Ja, ek dink veral...
Daar's nog 'n paar, maar
Ja. Nee, ek dink met Botha ook, ons kort nog 'n stewige biografie oor Botha wat hierdie tipe punte belig. Ek weet Richard Stein het nou iets geskryf, maar dit is nie so diepgaande nie, maar ek dink dis 'n goeie punt daar. Kyk, hy was ook baie ondernemend boer geweest. Hy het 'n soort van entrepreneurial kant aan hom gehad, jy weet. En so ek dink dit sluit aan by oor die vleisvoorsiening aan die myne. Swart Smuts was natuurlik hoogs intelligent en hy het net maar hy het ook daai eerbetoon verwelkom.
Dit was sy swakpunt.
Ja, en ek stem mee saam met De Wet ook, jy weet dat ja, dis die probleem.
Ja, maar De Wet het geweet hy's 'n nul buite die oorlog.
Ja, hy was 'n swak politikus, jy weet, hy was
'n swak boer.
Ja, hy was 'n nul nie. Hy was baie hoog aangeskrewe sosiaal. Maar polities, jy weet, het hy na die oorlog. Maar net op Louis Botha en Chris is interessant in die Land Commission's Blouboek is daar getuienis voor die kommissie in 1901. Ek kan nou nie die persoon se
hy 2000 pond braai ontvang. Het is die enigste plek waar ek ooit gelees het. Maar jy weet, ek sê nie dit is so nie, maar dit
Van wie af het jy braai gekry?
nee, dit is wat ek nou sê, die getuienis is voor daai land settlement mense Albert sal nou daai blou boeke ken, daar is drie van hulle, ek het die nommers, die CD-nommers verkeerd. Maar daar is getuienis, jy weet dat hy dit ontvang het, ek kan die detail nie onthou nie. Maar dit is natuurlijk nooit gestaaf.
Ja.
En jy weet, die vraag is altyd, jy weet, dis maar 'n ding van contemporaire geskiedenis teen vandagse standaarde. Ou moet daarom moet nou ook 'n bietjie oor die nepotisme en daai goed seker 'n bietjie toelaat vir die trends van die tyd, jy weet.
Ja, nee, he's probably an early trailblazer, you weet.
Ja.
Okay, ek dink dit stap aan. Chris, jy die laaste woord.
Professor het ons nou op 'n baie goeie toer gevat van jou kunsdae af en die staatjie wat jou vader geplant het en jou belangstelling aan die brand te sit en ook hoe jy te werk gegaan het om jou boeke na te vors en so aan en dit was nou 'n oggend goed spandeer en ook om te hoor hoe dat ons voorouers dit as stigmaties beskou het om geëtiketeerd te word as joiners en verraaiers en sovoorts, meelopers en die wat sommer net eintlik grens op het en op die plaas gaan sit het of oor die grens geklim het. Maar ja, dankie daarvoor en mense soos julle wat die Anglo-Boer Oorlog navors en dit te boek stel. Dit gee daarom ook vir julle 'n mate van onsterflikheid hoor. En vandat ek by hierdie organisasie aangesluit het, het ek geweldig geleer van mense soos Pieter, ek leer vandag nog van mense soos jy. En daar is Arnold en menigte ander en uniformdeskundiges soos Zedef. Nee, dankie daarvoor. Ons waardeer dat jy tyd ingeruim het hiervoor om 'n draai te kom maak en dit met ons te deel. En ons het gedink dit is baie van pas. Jy was saam met ons.
O ja, dis van ja, dankie ja, dis ja. Ja.
Ek het 'n sak daar so. So ons het gedink.
Ja.
Hierdie Chenin Blanc en hierdie Shiraz.
Ja, nee, dankie.
Sal jy so 'n bietjie
Ja.
terugneem na vorige
Ja.
drukkie van ons. En voor ek vergeet, een van hierdie behoort aan my.
Ja. Ja, nee, oké. Oké.
Dankie allemaal voor
Ja.
de opkomst. En die, remember 16th of December is our next meeting at the Lorraine Hall. Excuse toch, en alsjeblieft, je moet nooit, you must never become a graduate of the University of England. That's not all, rather read.
Die bestuur het net gevra wanneer ons uitgaan, die wat dalk gebeur wil gaan koffie of tee drink en so aan. Daar's 'n hele toonbank vol vrugtesappe. Dit behoort aan 'n ander groep ingeval.